All right. Well, my voice is finally back, so as promised, I'm going to do a little bit of a light lecture here for you guys based on Chapter 12, the notes I already handed out while I was sick, and just kind of go over what those notes cover and what we were supposed to have covered during those lectures that unfortunately we had to cancel. Chapter 12 is the Paleozoic life history of the Earth. Now, this starts off with the idea or the fact that in August 30th through 31st of 1909, a gentleman by the name of Charles D. Walcott discovered fossils um, of the first soft body traces on a trail on the Burgess Ridge in Canada, British Columbia to be exact. This provided a glimpse into an almost unknown world at that time from the Middle Cambrian. Over 60% of the total fossil assemblage of more than 100 different genera are soft-bodied organisms. These are organisms that have no hard parts, therefore they normally do not fossilize. Um, this was comparable to present-day marine communities. So it was a setup that basically looked, even though the animals were not similar, the way the diversity occurred within the community looks similar to what we see today. Now, this also represents part of what was called at the time the Cambrian explosion. This is the beginning of the Paleozoic era, where animals with skeletons or otherwise hard parts suddenly appeared within the fossil record. Until the evolution of the Ediacaran fauna, the Earth was populated primarily by single-celled organisms. Now, the cause of the sudden appearance of so many different animal phyla during the early Cambrian is heavily debated, really heavily debated. One hypothesis that personally I think seems to have the best explanation for this is the snowball Earth event. This is the second potential snowball Earth event to have occurred, and it broke up around 600 million years ago, just before the start of the Paleozoic with the Precambrian, and or with the Cambrian, I should say. And basically the idea being is that Earth was frozen down pretty much close to, if not all the way down to the poles. So what you probably would have had are these microclimates, these areas of warm pockets. And this allowed these life forms to basically be cut off from each other and allowed evolution to basically occur in these small places. And then when everything thawed back out, warm conditions reappeared on the Earth, then those life forms were able to radiate out explosively and populate across the world. Now, it's safe to say that the roots of this explosion, however, go back into the Proterozoic. Geologic evidence points to glaciation at the end of the Proterozoic that was followed by global warming during the Cambrian, hence the idea for that it was a snowball Earth event that was the cause. Some think the ocean chemistry has changed that allowed for the skeleton formation by mineralization and is another response to, or it's another response to predatory development. When you look at evolution of life on the Earth, if you take a very close look at it, one of the things that you see is that by and far there is an ever constant arms race between life forms. Predator versus prey, okay? Plants versus herbivores. It is said that nature is not only red in tooth and claw, but green in thorn and root. So we see these responses. Cheetahs today. Cheetahs are fast because they hunt down antelope. Antelope are fast because they have to outrun cheetah. So you get this constant back and forth where in order to survive, you have to be a little bit better than what you're preying on if you're a predator. You have to be better than your predators if you're a prey. Now, the emergence of shelly fauna, the earliest hard parts belong to small animals producing small calcareous tubes that are associated with the Edicarian fauna, and followed by other microscopic skeletonized fossils in the early Cambrian, things like plankton type of animals. Now, an exoskeleton or a shell provides some advantages. It's protection from ultraviolet radiation, which means that those animals can get closer to the surface of the water and be protected from the UV radiation. If they're exposed to the air, it prevents them from drying out. So if you've got animals that are living within a tidal community where they're getting exposed to air for a few hours to multiple to 12 hours a day, that helps them survive. It allows for an increase in size. It provides attachment points for the muscles, which means a great increase in strength. Pound for pound, if you look at it, a human being, we have an internal skeleton. Our bones are on the inside, knock on bone. Look at an ant. An ant can lift much more than a human can, proportionally speaking, for their size. And that's because an exoskeleton allows for tremendous strength, but it limits you to size. It allows you to get to a certain size, but depending on your breathing apparatus and whatnot, you have to have really high degree of oxygen in the atmosphere to be able to grow large. As I remember reading a while back, and this is years ago now, over a decade now, there was a special building at ASU where it's basically a greenhouse that they grow insects in, and they pump the oxygen up to multiple levels above where we are at now. So instead of oxygen being 20-some%, they take the oxygen up to 24, 25, upwards towards 30%. They have dragonflies in there that grow to a wingspan of about more or less 1 foot. Double about the size of your average large dragonfly today, which biggest one I've ever seen is around 6 inches. So that's because of the breathing system of insects. They don't have lungs like us. They have these tubes within their body, and they need the oxygen percentage to be higher in order to grow larger. And of course, if you have an exoskeleton or a hard shell, that can provide protection against predators. We see evidence in the fossil records that suggests the impact of predation in the Cambrian was actually rather great. In fact, we see a large change in the nature of the protection that animals have that are obviously prey items, going hand in hand with rapid changes in the way predators prey on their food, especially with the development of mouth and teeth. Now, if we look at present-day marine ecosystems, we can kind of get an idea for what was happening in the past. Again, going back to this idea of uniformitarianism, that the present is the key to the past is the key to the future. Organisms in the water column above the seafloor are called pelagic and are subdivided into plankton, meaning they float, and nekton, meaning they swim. Organisms on the seafloor are called benthos, and they can either be sessile or mobile. Sessile means they basically don't move, mobile means they move. And you can split them into epiflora or epifauna, which live on the seafloor, or infauna, which actually live in the sediment that makes up the seafloor. Now, if we look at feeding strategies of most invertebrates, they're basically a handful of feeding strategies, mainly going to be suspension feeding, removal or consumption of microscopic plants and animals, as well as dissolved nutrients from the water. There are herbivores, which eat the plants that are growing along the bottom of the water or within the water column. There are carnivore scavengers. These are going to be the meat eaters. Now, generally speaking, usually most predators tend to be a combination of carnivore and scavenger. Why hunt something if you got a free meal, basically, is the idea. Very rarely do we see animals that are pure scavengers or pure carnivores. Then there are also sediment deposit feeders. These ingest sediment and extract nutrients from it. So they're filtering through the mud and muck to find things they can eat. Now we can define an organism's place where it lives and how it eats. So you can have a carnivorous nectonic organism. You can have a carnivorous benthosensal organism. Things of that nature. Now, when we look at an ecosystem, it has many different trophic levels. The idea is basically these are layers within the ecosystem, basically the food chain or food pyramid of the ecosystem. You have what you are called, at the bottom, your primary producers. These are autotrophs, organisms that manufacture their own food. These are organisms that are primarily going to be the basis of your entire food chain, and they produce their food in one of two general ways on this planet. The primary, most common, being that it is some form of photosynthesis. The other and lesser common, you have to go into the very deep oceans, are those animals that basically feed off of chemical energy being produced by the consumption of sulfur or other elements within the water column. You also have your primary consumers. The primary consumer feeds on the primary producer. Then you have secondary consumers, which feed on your primary consumers, tertiary consumers, which feed on your secondary consumers, and so forth and so on, until you get to your basically ultimate predator, which is the thing that feeds on everything and anything below it. Then you have also the last layer of this is what we call the transformers and decomposers. These are organisms and life forms that basically take dead organisms and break them back down into their basic components, which allow them to be used in some cases by the primary producers to produce their own food. Now, if we look at the Paleozoic invertebrate marine life, we have to keep in mind how geologic and evolutionary changes have led to an impact on the composition and structure of the ecosystems, especially the marine ecosystems during the Paleozoic. So what we'll do is we'll look at these kind of by the general communities during the certain periods of time. So for example, the Cambrian marine community. The Cambrian marine community was a time when body plans evolved and animals moved into new ecosystems. If you look in your book, page 239, let's see if we can get it. See, yeah, there's a picture of what we believe a marine ecosystem to have been like. During the Cambrian, there was a higher percentage of experiments in life form types, especially body plans, than any other time in geologic history. In fact, there are multiple times more types of animal life forms and body plans in the fossil record for the Cambrian than what we even see today. And this is in terms of just the body plans and specifics. So this is looking at the general basic highest level of your animal kingdom and the different major trunks of that tree of life. One of the successful groups in this time were the trilobites. They made up to half of the total fauna. Most of them were benthic, mobile, and they were sediment depositors. Trilobites are a type of arthropod, kind of look like this. Closest living thing that looks like them today would be a horseshoe crab, although if I remember correctly, I don't think they're actually directly related. Another life form that was very common at the time were brachiopods. Brachiopods are a type of bivalve. It's basically, think of it kind of like a piece of shellfish, like a clam or a scallop, but not directly related to them. It has a completely different way of its shell hinging together and the way the shell looks. You have the inarticulates, which had a chitanophosphate shell, which is basically chitin or chitin, however you want to pronounce it. Basically, the same thing. It makes up your cell, your skin to a degree, but more importantly, your hair or fingernails, along with a calcium phosphate that was in there as a hardener. It did not have a tooth or socket arrangement in it on their hinges, which means they're inarticulated hinges. You had the articulate brachiopods, which had a tooth and socket arrangement along the hinge line, which allows the hinge to flex and stay together. They tended to have shells that were a little harder, maybe a little more calcium carbonate shells in general, but they were present in the Cambrian but not really abundant until the Ordovician. These tend to be both benthic and sessile, and they are suspension feeders. And then you got the archaeosathenids, which were benthal, sensile, and we think they were suspension feeders. They're kind of a bizarre creature. They're kind of an animal form. They went extinct at the end of the Cambrian, but during the Cambrian, they were the primary builders of reefs. And this is what they looked like. Kind of like an ice cream cone with roots, basically. A waffle cone with roots. That's probably the best way to think of it. Now, the Burgess Shale biota is part of the Salk Sea transgression in the Corderillia. And the early Cambrian sands were covered by these black muds. These black muds allowed a diverse soft-bodied benthic community to be preserved, because you get this black mud covering down. When you cover a soft-bodied organism in a mud, you basically cut it off from oxygen, and that's the one thing you need to do to be able to preserve, in some way, shape, or form, soft parts. And so those soft-bodied organisms then basically carbonized over time. The organisms that are in the Burgess Shale appear to represent the rootstock and basic body plans from which all present-day invertebrates evolved. The exact number of phyla within the Cambrian is still debated, and additional discoveries in additional locations are changing the categorization of these phyla. So it's really an area of great interest to paleontologists and geologists, because this is really where the whole diversity of life comes from in general. This is where the phyla, the major categories of life forms on the earth, of animal forms, come from. Now, if we skip forward to the Ordovician marine communities, this is where we're looking at basically the Tippecanoe sequence, which resulted in widespread inundation of the North American craton. Sedimentary patterns changed, and the fauna underwent striking changes. Ordovician is characterized by continued diversification of brachiopods, especially the articulate brachiopods, and the adaptive radiation of many other phyla, including things like the bryozoans and corals, with a dramatic increase in the number and type of shelly fauna. In fact, there was so much biodiversification happening in the Ordovician, it's sometimes referred to as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. This is basically an increased diversity in marine invertebrates, the rise of archaeotocs. These are organically walled phytoplankton. They had an explosion in diversity and abundance, and became the primary phytoplankton group of the Paleozoic. The archaeosathids were replaced by bryozoas, stromatoliphorids, as well as tabulate and rugose corals by the mid-Ordovician as the primary reef builders. Three fossil groups proved to be useful for biostratigraphic correlation, and these are the articulated brachiopods, the graptolites, and conodonts. The articulated brachiopods, these guys right here, were benthic sessile suspension feeders, but they're very widespread, which is one of the reasons why they prove very good for biostratigraphic correlation. Graptolites, we now think they were planktonic, with some species that only lasted about 2 million years, which is great for us from a stratigraphic standpoint, because if something's planktonic, it's going to spread over a wide area, but with a narrow time frame for each of the species, this makes them an excellent guide fossil, especially during the Ordovician and the Silurian. Conodonts, on the other hand, let's see, before I go for graptolites, fossils look like these, and these are the conodonts. Conodonts are these tooth-like fossils that we find that are comprised of apatite, basically, a calcium phosphate, same thing as your teeth, and they're considered to be part of a bilateral symmetrical feeding apparatus on the head of maybe an eel-like or worm-like swimming organism. Unfortunately, so far we have not found a conodont fossil that I'm aware of that had any soft tissue preservation around it also. So what this really looked like, your guess is as good as ours. Now, the end of the Ordovician is a time of mass extinction. More than 100 families of marine invertebrates became extinct. Half of the brachiopods, gone. And half of the bryozoan, gone. They all died out. This is possibly due to extensive glaciation as Gondwana moved over the South Pole, causing a decrease in sea levels as well as causing cooler temperatures. That also may have affected the chemistry of the ocean as well, which may be why certain things went under at that point. Now, the Silurian to Devonian marine communities, the mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician led to a rediversification. As I said before, mass extinctions are a beneficial thing, if you can really comprehend that, to biodiversity on this planet. Every time there's a mass extinction, biodiversity on this planet radically increases. And this is because you have all of these new ecosystem opportunities that have opened up and life forms take advantage. So we see the recovery of many groups, especially in the brachiopods, the bryozoans, gastropods, bivalves, corals, crinoids, and graptolites. The Silurian and Devonian were times of major reef building, with reefs being built up to even larger sizes than what had been seen previously. Now, generally speaking, those reefs are going to be dominated by the tabulate and the colonial rugose corals and the stromatoporids. We also see during this time the development of creatures that we call sea scorpions or eurypterids. They were abundant in the Devonian and the Silurian. And the reason they're called sea scorpions is, well, they kind of look like swimming scorpions. They were abundant in the Silurian and Devonian. They expanded into brackish and freshwater habitats. They even started to expand onto land. The other creature that came across during this time are the ammonoids. They evolved from nautiloids. There is still a living ancestor of the nautiloids today, the chambered nautilus. I don't think I've got a picture of it, but they're basically the coiled type of shells. Excuse me a moment. What's that? Hello? I'm doing something right now. Can I call you back? Yo? Can I call you back? All right. Okay, sorry about that. I'll try to shorten that out. But basically, the ammonoids, the chambered nautilus, it's a coiled shell. Basically, it's related to octopus and squids. Basically, imagine a squid in a coiled shell. That's probably the best way to think about it. They developed. They evolved from the ammonoids developed from the nautiloids in the early Devonian, and they rapidly diversified with distinctive suture patterns and very short stratigraphic ranges and widespread distribution. They make great guide fossils. What we mean by suture pattern is basically inside the shell, you have this coiled shell. Inside the shell, there are walls, basically, that are built by the animal to live on. Where those walls intersect the outer wall, you get a pattern. The more complicated that pattern is, the more advanced the animal is in terms of whether it's a nautiloid or an ammonite. Ammonites have the most complicated patterns, and it's also what we use to identify the specific species. The end of the Devonian marine reef communities collapsed. We just basically, everything fell apart. We see land-based seedless vascular plants appear to be unaffected at this time. So whatever's happening that caused the extinction event is not affecting land-based plants. So it's probably something else that's going on within the ocean system. We see tropical reef communities being more affected than the higher latitude communities. So we think this might be basically a cooling event responsible for it. Then we move into the Carboniferous and the Permian marine communities. The Carboniferous invertebrate communities, in response to the late Devonian extinctions, as life always does, it renewed adaptive radiation and rediversification. The brachiopods and ammonoids quickly recovered and assumed important ecological roles, reaching their greatest diversity in this period of time. The lacy bryozoans and crinoids also flourished during this time. The decline in stromatopores and tabulating regrowth corals caused the near disappearance of large reefs. There were small reefs at the time, but not the large ones. The small reefs tended to be dominated by crinoids and their relatives blastoids, as well as lacy bryozoans, brachiopods, and calcareous algae. When we move into the Permian, the marine faunas resembled those of the Carboniferous, but they weren't as widely distributed. Fusolinids also evolved during the Mississippian, late Mississippian, and diversified in the Pennsylvanian. That's part of the Carboniferous. They're basically rice grain sized fossils of some sort of planktonic creature. Now, let's talk briefly about mass extinctions. Throughout Earth history, plants and animal species have died out, become extinct. There have been several geologically brief intervals where a large number of species, a majority of species, have died out. These are what we call a mass extinction. A mass extinction affects all life, both marine and land. So it doesn't hit just one area, it hits everything. What we do see, though, is that we can figure out what is more likely to survive and what is less likely to survive based on looking at the habit of the plant or animal. And basically what I mean by this is whether or not the plant or animal is what we call a generalist or a specialist. Some creatures require specific conditions, whether it's an environment, specific type of food, or a specific way of breeding in order to continue to live and propagate themselves. So they've specialized to fill an ecological niche. Anything that's specialized to fulfill a very specific ecological niche or requires very specific conditions or items for survival, is going to end up being more susceptible to dying off if there is any environmental stress whatsoever. A generalist, on the other hand, occupies a wide variety of environments. It has eats a wide variety of foods, reproduces in a wide variety of environments, and so it's much less susceptible to extinction. In fact, generally speaking, generalists survive, specialists die. The first mass extinction involved the archaearchs. There were several other extinctions that happened similarly. The end of the Ordovician, which had many invertebrates, the end of the Devonian, which hit the reef-building communities, the end of the Cretaceous, which basically the dinosaurs, most dinosaurs, not all, most, all the pterosaurs and the large seagoing marine reptiles, and then the end of the Pleistocene, where we saw the megafaunal, such as the Irish elk, the mastodon, the mammoth, the giant sloth, the giant beaver, etc. But the most severe, the worst mass extinction that took place was the end of the Permian, where 50% of all the marine invertebrate fauna and 96% of marine invertebrate species, as well as 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species, and about a third of all the insects on the planet went extinct. Why? We're not sure. An asteroid is a possible choice, but we don't have evidence of an asteroid impact. Now, granted, the Earth is 70% ocean. The ocean basins are relatively young. They're younger than the Permian. So if it was an asteroid that had hit the Earth in the oceans, evidence for that has long since been recycled into the crust. What we do know, however, is that the oceans were regressing. We know that deserts were growing. We know that the world was heating up. We also know that in what is now Siberia, several large fissures had opened up and enormous volumes of basalt were pouring out, covering more than 2 million square kilometers of land. This released large amounts of CO2, sulfur dioxide, and water vapor, as well as chlorine and other gases such as fluorine. The sulfur oxides and the water vapor, sulfur dioxide and water vapor make sulfuric acid when they combine together, whereas carbon dioxide and water vapor are both greenhouse gases. So one of the hypotheses now that we have working for the Permian is, as the Earth was heating up, we had this major volcanic event that lasted for millions of years. This pumped large amounts of greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere. At the same time, you had the deserts growing, because basically you had Pangea forming, which was cutting off large areas of land from a water source. So basically the Earth began to warm. As it began to warm, eventually it began to affect the oceans. As the oceans warmed, methane that was preserved within the oceans as methane hydrates, which form at ocean bottoms in the cold water, was released. Methane is a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide ever can be. This basically accelerated the warming of the planet. It also displaced the oxygen within the oceans and allowing anaerobic bacteria to flourish. Anaerobic bacteria have a tendency to produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most life forms. In fact, hydrogen sulfide in just a few percent of the air being hydrogen sulfide will kill you in minutes. So it's something that we know had to have happened. And basically we see that it had to have happened because during the end of the Permian, one of the things that happens in many of the marine communities is we see a fossilization process where the fossils are preserved in what is called pyrite. Pyrite is a mineral that's based on hydrogen sulfide. or not, it takes place with hydrogen sulfide that merges with iron, so it creates iron sulfide and creates this, or fool's gold basically. And so you create these fossils that are made out of pyrite. And we only see this nowadays happening in this pyrite formation in areas where you have low oxygen, high sulfur contents, and hydrogen sulfide provides that. So we think that's what was happening. So that's probably what led up. And then when that hydrogen sulfide started going onto land, again, only 3 to 5% hydrogen sulfide in the air is deadly to most animals. So, but that does it for chapter 12. I owe you guys 13 and 14 here. I'll get those done as soon as I can, get them up, and I'll be back in a week. Have a good one.